The Haunted Theater. It was an old theater, one that had stood in the heart of the city for over a century. The faded marquee, once vibrant with advertisements of the latest plays and musicals, now barely clung to the rusted iron frame. A century of dust and decay covered its walls, yet the theater had managed to stay open, even as its neighbors crumbled into disrepair. Few dared to walk down the alley that led to its entrance, for it was known that the building had a dark history, one that locals whispered about but never dared to speak of openly. The theater had always been a place of mystery, and not just because of its age or its eccentric design. There were stories, dark tales that had been passed down from generation to generation, and for good reason. It was said that the theater was haunted by the spirits of actors who had once graced its stage, only to meet untimely and tragic deaths. Some claimed to have heard the ghostly echoes of their voices in the dead of night, calling out their lines as if they were still performing for an audience. Others swore that they had seen shadowy figures moving behind the stage curtains, only to vanish when they got too close. For years, the theater had been closed to the public, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. But as time went on, the stories of the haunted theater began to fade, and eventually, the building was sold. Enter Clara Lawson, a struggling actress looking for a place to practice. She had heard the stories, of course, but she was young, naive, and desperate for any opportunity to hone her craft. The fact that the theater was so cheap to rent was enough to tempt her into ignoring the warnings. After all, she told herself, there were no such things as ghosts. She had a part to play, and the stage was calling her. Clara's first night in the theater was eerily quiet. The air was stale, and the heavy curtains in the lobby hung like shadows, as if they had been there for decades. The dim lights flickered above her head as she made her way to the dressing room. It was then that she noticed something strange. The temperature seemed to drop as she walked further into the building. The chill was almost palpable, and her breath came out in visible puffs, despite the fact that it was a warm summer evening outside. She shrugged it off, convinced it was just the result of the old building's lack of proper ventilation. After all, the theater was practically abandoned. But when Clara stepped onto the stage for the first time, she felt a sudden unease that she couldn't shake. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, as if the building itself were alive, groaning under her weight. The theater felt like a forgotten relic, a place that hadn't seen a real performance in decades. She looked out at the empty seats, imagining the grandeur of the crowd that would have once filled them. Then she heard a faint sound just on the edge of her hearing. It was a soft rustling like whispers, but she was alone in the building. She paused, trying to locate the source of the noise. Her heart began to race as she stared into the darkened corners of the theater. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was then that the lights flickered and the whispering grew louder. "Is someone there?" Clara called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. The whispers continued, growing louder and more distinct, but still unintelligible. She took a cautious step forward, feeling the floorboards groan underfoot. And then suddenly the whispers stopped. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The silence in the theater was deafening. The eerie stillness stretched on for what seemed like hours before she finally turned and made her way back to the dressing room, her mind racing with questions. She thought of leaving then, of never returning. But something inside her, A desire to prove herself, to conquer the fear, kept her there. The following days were a blur of rehearsals, trying to ignore the strange feelings that crept up on her in the dark corners of the theater. Every time Clara stepped onto the stage, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers continued, faint and distant, but always there, as if the spirits of the theater's past were beckoning her to join them. And then, one night, Clara discovered something truly horrifying. It was late, and she was preparing to leave the theater after another long rehearsal. The night air had grown thick with fog, and she found herself lingering in the empty lobby, her coat draped over her arm. As she passed the entrance to the stage, she heard a noise, a soft rustling, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible laugh. Clara stopped in her tracks. The sound seemed to come from the stage, but she was certain she had locked it when she arrived. Her heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The laughter, low, guttural, came again, this time louder. It was followed by a sharp, haunting voice. "Join us, Clara." The words sent a chill down her spine, freezing her in place. The voice was unmistakably feminine, but it was older, colder, and carried an unmistakable malice. Clara bolted towards the stage, not thinking, but driven by an urge she couldn't explain. She flung the stage door open and stepped inside, but the moment her foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She whirled around, panic rising in her chest, but the door was locked, no longer opening from the inside. The whispers grew louder now, swirling around her, filling her mind. There was no escape. It was then that Clara saw them, the figures standing at the far side of the stage. They were dressed in old-fashioned costumes, their faces painted with the exaggerated makeup of past performances. But their eyes were hollow, black as night, staring directly at her. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The figures didn't answer. They simply stood there, watching her, unmoving. Then, with a sudden movement, one of them took a step forward. Clara froze in terror. The figure's face was obscured by a mask, but she could hear the raspy breath coming from beneath it. The other actors, if that's what they were, began to move as well, circling around her like vultures. A cold, malevolent laughter filled the air as the figures reached out to her. The first actor, a woman in a tattered Victorian dress, placed her cold, bony hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara recoiled in horror as the woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin. "We never leave, Clara," the woman hissed. "We perform forever. In this place, trapped for eternity." The other figures closed in, their eyes empty and dark as they reached for her. Clara screamed, trying to pull away, but the hands were relentless. Each touch felt like ice against her skin. The spirits began to pull her toward the center of the stage, dragging her into the spotlight. As they did, Clara caught sight of their faces, mangled, disfigured from the accidents and tragedies that had claimed their lives over the years. There was the old Shakespearean actor, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, the young ingenue, her face frozen in terror as if she had been struck down in the middle of a performance, and the grotesque, bloated figure of a man whose mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Please," Clara gasped, her voice breaking. I don't want to be like you." The spirits laughed again, louder this time, their voices a chorus of agony and madness. "You will be like us," the woman whispered. sooner than you think. In a final desperate attempt to escape, Clara tried to break free, but the spirit's grip tightened. The laughter grew deafening, the room spinning around her as the spotlight above blazed brighter and brighter. And then everything went black. The next morning, the theater was silent again, its lights flickering to life in the dim daylight. There was no sign of Clara. The stage was empty, the curtains drawn. But the whispers had not stopped. They still echoed in the shadows, just beyond the veil of the present. The spirits were still there, waiting for their next victim. The theater, like its actors, was trapped in time, forever haunting the city. Clara's disappearance became another tragic chapter in the theater's dark history, a story that would be whispered in the streets for years to come. The once vibrant playhouse remained eerily silent, but those who passed by late at night still swore they could hear the sound of footsteps on the stage, dancing, laughing, and begging for their next performance.